You already had mentioned, that famous passage from Matthew's gospel. So it says, "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." This is not the only text, but this is the kind of critical New Testament text for the authority, which is when the church has always said this is kind of the institution of this office, is when he changes his name from Simon to Peter to the rock. And then it says he gives him the keys to the kingdom. One of the main points that the church always talks about is it's not the New Testament in isolation, it's the Old Testament as well. So going back to the Old Testament, you have the idea of a steward. So the king or the ruler of a land would have a steward who he would put in charge during certain times and in certain instances. So the one that kind of comes to mind a lot is Joseph in Egypt. So Pharaoh gives Joseph kind of charge of all of he literally says over the land of Egypt. So the storehouses, and he kind of holds the power of distributing grain and all that. So that's a steward. So the main text though, that we see, which Jesus actually is almost quoting, is from the prophet Isaiah, which is in chapter 22. So we have the steward that the prophet's talking to, whose name is Shebna, who is ordered by the prophet to give his authority to Eliakim. So we have this succession of stewards. So it says, "In that day I will call my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and I will clothe him with your robe, and will bind your belt on him, and will commit your authority to his hand. And he shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. And I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. He shall open, and none shall shut, and he shall shut, and none shall open." Which, if you go back to Matthew, that's a direct parallel. So we see that the steward is the representative of the king, and that steward has the authority to open and shut the keys to the kingdom of the house. And that's what Jesus is referencing here, right? So he gives authority to someone, namely Cephas, to Peter, who then has the authority to the kingdom. So that's a big reference point for the church of, okay, well, not only did Jesus say, you are the authority figure, but he's hearkening back to the image of the steward in the Old Testament, which is showing that, yes, Jesus is the king. The Pope is not the head of, the faith in that sense, it is Jesus. But in Jesus' stead, Jesus gives his authority to somebody else, namely to his representative on earth.
And that word is called the vicar, what literally means to stand in, to aid, and he's called the Vicar of Christ. He has many, many titles as Pope. Bishop of Rome would be probably the one title that would be the biggest, title, because ultimately he is a bishop, just like any other bishop throughout the world. He's a shepherd over his people, and the priests get their authority from the bishop. So we get our authority from the bishops, and he is the head bishop, and therefore got the title the Pope. We're an apostolic church. The four marks of the church: one, holy, Catholic, little c, and apostolic, and that little a, apostolic. As opposed to a big A, apostle would be one of the apostles. So it's important to realize that as an apostolic church, Peter was one of these apostles.
The issue right now with, if you ask any person in the world, is everything the Pope says true? Papal infallibility, which that word might not ring kind of in your ears that much, but basically, if you look at anything in the media, if a document comes out, it's the media is going to talk about it because the Pope is the Pope. And if it's anything that sounds different, it's oh my gosh, the Pope's changing teachings, or the Pope is doing this or that. I think for Catholics, we have a little more sensibility to this, but Some of us might not, and that's why we want to talk about what the Pope actually says and how the church has always understood the Pope's role. So the Pope is the authority figure of the church. He is Christ's vicar on earth, and he is the representative of Christ to the world, which gives him an authority that nobody else has. Even the other bishops. He is a bishop, so there's no like elevation as far as like an ordination higher than a bishop. But he is the Bishop of Rome, and that see has a different authority than others, which makes him, the servant of the servants of God, which is another title.
When he does something official, he has to tell us that he's going to do that official. It's actually called ex cathedra, which is interesting. The word cathedral comes from chair of the bishop. That's literally what the word cathedral means.
Talking about, you mentioned ex cathedra, and that's the church's official like doctrinal pronouncement of this is when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, meaning when he speaks from the chair. It literally means like by his authority as Pope, he is speaking ex cathedra, so he's speaking from the chair. But if you kind of take it down to the more local level, the chair of the bishop, so for us, Archbishop Brody, his chair, nobody sits there because he is the authority of that chair of this diocese. So that is his seat of authority. So going to the Pope, we say that everything the Pope says is of importance. So because of who he is, so you take everything kind of on faith, but that does not mean that everything he says is true or has to be believed. It means that you should, I would say, you should take everything with charity. So you should assume charity. But as far as, these have to be believed, there is a very particular set of criteria that has to be met for that. And we would say he has to be doing it intentionally. So he can't just, off the cuff say something. So it has to be intentional. It has to be for everybody. So it has to be for the universal church in the world. And it has to only be in matters of faith and morals.
And also the Pope works in union with the church. So he has a college, he has a College of Cardinals, but he also has a magisterium. And that magisterium is extremely important because that's who he consults with before he would make any kind of ex cathedra statement. He would consult with that magisterium.
Yeah, and then going towards the magisterium, so the Pope has his own office, which is the office of the papacy. But then the church has the magisterium, which is the formal teaching authority of the church. So the Pope ex cathedra speaking, those are instances where whatever is being said has to be believed. And there's only been twice. In the history of the church, there's been twice, funnily enough, about Mary. The Immaculate Conception, and then the Assumption of Mary. And one was in 1854, and the other was in 1950. And that was it. Nothing else.
And even though the Immaculate Conception was declared, a dogma of the church in 1854, literally from the time of the apostles. Now think about this, from the time of the apostles, they had believed in the Immaculate Conception. Yeah. So the faithful believed this all along the time. So the Pope just really, in working with the magisterium, took what, the people already believed and declared that to be official dogma of the church, official teachings of the church.
And that's super important because it's not like when the Pope does something like this, which again, it's only happened twice. It's not a new teaching. It is a confirming of something that has been believed. And usually, almost always, pretty much always, it's in response to doubt. We are pronouncing this to you so that you can believe and so that you have no doubt anymore that this is what we have believed from the beginning. The first one was Blessed Pius IX in 1854, which was the Immaculate Conception. It says, "We declare, pronounce, and define that the doctrine which holds the Most Blessed Virgin Mary in the first instance of her conception, by a singular grace and privilege granted by Almighty God in view of the merits of Jesus Christ, the Savior of the human race was preserved free from all stain of original sin, is a doctrine revealed by God and therefore to be believed firmly and constantly by all the faithful. And if you read that, it's a whole document, a couple page document, but that's the actual declaring statement. It's very, very particular. We declare, we pronounce and define this doctrine. It's not, you don't just take a sentence out. Like, this is a very particular, which again, it has to be intentional. It has to be on faith and morals. It has to be for everybody. And this is when he pronounced this doctrine. But it's going back to, this is what Jesus Christ himself revealed to us and what God has revealed to his church from the beginning. The next one, the last one officially, was in 1950, which was Pope Pius XII. Which was the Assumption of Mary. It says, by our own authority, we pronounce, declare, and define, again, much the same language, to be divinely revealed dogma that the Immaculate Mother of God, the ever Virgin Mary, having completed the course of her earthly life, was assumed body and soul into heavenly glory. So again, it's almost the exact same formula, because again, it had to be intentional. It was not random. And again, this was not like an interview that he did this. This was a official pronounced document of the church. And I think, just kind of bringing it to a close, the last thing I want to say, which is, I think, helpful for us in the parish, I think that what the Pope does and what sets apart the church, the Pope is a visible authority and a voice for unity for the church. Now, I will say, that does not mean that unity is guaranteed, as we see. However, what it does do is, which is what Jesus instituted it for, is it is a visible, unitive figure to rally Christianity around Jesus Christ himself and keep the teaching to be correct. And so that there is a authority figure who can dispute and be that voice of unity when there is doubt. Time after time after time, you have the Pope stepping in as, this is what we believe. Not what I believe, but this is what we believe as a church. You have him, again, these two times when he's speaking ex cathedra in the past 200 years, more particularly through councils, through all the bishops gathered together. In Vatican II, you had 2,000 bishops gathered, which is kind of the teaching body of the church when all the bishops are gathered together. But the church also makes a distinction. It's the bishops gathered together with the Pope. So it's not, you don't exclude the Pope. It's the bishops gathered with the Pope together. And that constitutes the authority of the church. And so we see that, in the councils with the Pope gathered, that's where the authority of the church lies.